Ozzy Osbourne wasn't supposed to make it past 30. Not with the way he lived, not with the storms he summoned, or the ones he willingly walked into. His name became synonymous with excess, with madness, with a kind of reckless freedom that most wouldn't survive a year in. Yet somehow, he did. He outlived the critics, outlasted the scandals, survived overdoses that would have buried lesser men, collapsed backstage and still returned for encores, canceled tours, then rebooked them with barely a pulse. Ozzy refused to go quietly. Every time the world thought, this is it, he'd rise, like a myth forged in fire and fueled by sheer defiance. And now, with the world holding its breath in the eerie stillness of his passing, the final moments of the man who roared are reduced to a whisper, one sentence, the last thing he ever said to Sharon, the woman who stood by him through it all. What did Ozzy Osbourne say with his final breath? That mystery hangs heavy in the air, because the Prince of Darkness didn't just leave. He left behind a silence too loud to ignore. Before the madness, before the mayhem, before the screaming crowds and bat-biting headlines, there was just a boy. A small, awkward, insecure boy named John Michael Osbourne. He was born into the bleak, industrial heart of Birmingham, England, a place where dreams were considered a liability. He didn't shine in school. He didn't impress his teachers. His thick accent made him hard to understand. His dyslexia made him easy to overlook. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't popular. But inside that quiet child was something electric, an urgency no one could quite name, a pressure that built inside his bones. Music wasn't an escape. It was oxygen. When he met guitarist Tony Iommi, bassist Geezer Butler, and drummer Bill Ward, it wasn't fate. It was a detonation. Together, they formed Black Sabbath, and they didn't just introduce heavy metal, they summoned it. Their sound was a sonic rebellion, slower, darker, more primal than anything the world had heard. Critics scoffed, fans surrendered, and at the center of that eruption was Ozzy, not polished, not trained, but real. He didn't sing. He channeled. He was the frequency of frustration, rage, alienation, and he gave it a voice. Ozzy Osbourne didn't climb the ranks of music by playing it safe. He didn't sculpt an image, he shattered it. While other artists tried to perfect their branding, Ozzy grabbed the mic, ripped up the rule book, and became chaos. He was unpredictable, unfiltered, and somehow unrelentingly magnetic. He didn't wear a costume on stage, he wore himself. His vocals weren't polished by vocal coaches or studio magic. They were ragged, feral, unrefined. But that's why they hit so hard, because what poured out of him was guttural truth. He wasn't trying to impress you. He was just trying to survive. Fans felt that. They needed it. Ozzy didn't give them songs. He gave them catharsis. He gave them permission to feel angry, broken, weird, out of place. And in doing so, he became the patron saint of misfits. He didn't just lead a genre. He started a movement. Ozzy Osbourne became a legend not by rising above the darkness, but by wading into it and owning it. To the media, Ozzy was madness personified. The wild eyes, the incoherent interviews, the infamous bat incident. The headlines wrote themselves. But behind the caricature was precision. He wasn't stumbling through his career blindly. He was calculating, quietly meticulous. Behind every chaotic show was a man who had planned. He memorized set lists. He knew his bandmates' rhythms like his own heartbeat. He noticed if the pyro went off a second too late. He remembered every single name on his tour crew. While other rock stars bailed on gigs for migraines, Ozzy dragged himself on stage in pain with a cane, even in a wheelchair. Sometimes he needed help just to walk, but still, he showed up. Because to him, performing wasn't indulgence, it was responsibility, a sacred contract with his fans. The public saw the madness, his crew saw the method. They saw a man who could burn down a stadium one night and be up the next morning asking about the lighting cues. That was the Ozzy the world never saw. And maybe that's what made him even more legendary. Ozzy didn't walk this journey alone. Behind the madness, there was Sharon. Not just his wife, not just his manager, she was the architect of his second act. When Black Sabbath kicked him out and he spiraled into oblivion, Sharon found him in a hotel room, half conscious and surrounded by emptiness. She didn't leave. She revived him. She booked the gigs, negotiated the deals, battled the labels. But more than that, she stood in front of the chaos, shielded him from the industry, picked him up when he fell, again and again. Their love wasn't clean, it wasn't glamorous. It was brutal, bloody, and at times seemingly broken. There were betrayals, scandals, interventions, public meltdowns. But there was always love. And Sharon didn't stay because she was weak. She stayed because she saw him, the real him. The broken boy behind the screaming man, the soul behind the spectacle. She saw what millions missed, and she fought, not just for his career, but for his soul. Without Sharon, there is no Ozzy as we know him. And in the end, it was her hand he held when his voice fell to a whisper. Ozzy Osbourne may have been the Prince of Darkness on stage, but at home, he was something else entirely. He was a father who wept watching old home videos, a husband who left voice notes just to say, "I miss you," a man who hugged his dogs like they were the only peace he could find. To his children, Amy, Kelly, and Jack, Ozzy wasn't just a global icon. He was dad. They saw his brilliance. They also saw his breakdowns. They witnessed the struggles, the addiction, the depression, the days when getting out of bed felt like a miracle. But they also saw his strength, his resilience, his refusal to pretend. Ozzy didn't hide his flaws from his family. He let them in. He let them see him fully, unfiltered, sometimes terrifyingly raw, but always real. And they loved him not because he was famous, but because he never gave up. Even at his lowest, he kept trying. And in a world of illusion, that kind of honesty is a rare kind of magic. The world knew Ozzy the legend. His family knew Ozzy the man. And that man, he was worth loving. Time, relentless and unforgiving, eventually caught up to the man who once seemed immortal. Ozzy Osbourne's body, after decades of defiance, began to betray him. Years of headbanging, drug abuse, alcohol, surgeries, and neurological disorders slowly robbed him of the mobility he once flaunted on stage. His hands shook, his steps faltered, his back curved. But the fire was never extinguished. Even as doctors begged him to slow down, Ozzy kept whispering the same words to those closest to him. "I'm not done yet." He clung to the mic stand like a lifeline, like it was the only thing anchoring him to earth. And maybe it was. In one of his final public appearances, Ozzy shuffled onto the stage, no longer the wild man sprinting barefoot across amplifiers, but a soldier, battle-worn but still reporting for duty. The spotlight hit him. The crowd roared. And then in that trembling silence, he sang. The notes weren't perfect. The power wasn't what it once was. But the emotion, the truth in every line, it was more piercing than ever. His voice didn't just carry sound, it carried history. Decades of agony, triumph, collapse, resurrection. Each lyric became a time capsule, and every fan in that stadium knew they were witnessing something sacred. He wasn't singing to impress. He was singing to say goodbye. He no longer leapt across the stage. Sometimes he didn't even stand. But what he did do, what he always did, was show up. Because for Ozzy, showing up was the performance. It was the rebellion. It was the love letter. While the world expected him to fade into silence, he gave them one final echo, a closing chapter sung not in rage, but in reverence. Ozzy Osbourne never wore a mask, because he had nothing to hide. In an industry built on illusion, on curated personas and PR-crafted redemption arcs, Ozzy stood defiant, damaged, and defiantly real. He admitted his flaws before anyone could weaponize them. "I should have been dead 1,000 times," he once said, not as a punchline, but as a confession. He owned the nights he couldn't remember, the pain he caused, the bridges he nearly burned to ash. And in that ownership, he gave his fans permission to breathe, to be imperfect, to be broken, to be human. He didn't talk about addiction like it was a chapter in a memoir. He talked about it like it was still in the room, like it could knock on the door at any moment and drag him back. He admitted to the cravings, the slips, the shame, and the scars. And when he spoke about depression, he didn't romanticize it. He described it as a shadow, a silent monster that followed him through every tour, every celebration, every standing ovation. "I could be surrounded by people," he said once, "and still feel completely alone." And millions of fans understood. Because in those words, they saw themselves. And then there was the fear. Ozzy's fear that age would strip away his mind, his memory, his ability to matter. He spoke of forgetting lyrics, of trembling through interviews, of wondering whether he was becoming a burden to Sharon. He cried, often on camera, not performatively, not for drama, just because it hurt. And instead of being mocked, he was embraced. Because if Ozzy Osbourne, the man who howled at the moon, who bled rebellion, could admit fear, then maybe the rest of us could stop pretending too. When the news broke, Ozzy Osbourne, dead at 76, the world didn't react like it had lost a celebrity. It reacted like it had lost a heartbeat. The silence that followed felt too loud, too empty, as if some ancient bell had finally stopped ringing. In his hometown of Birmingham, fans spilled into the streets beneath a towering mural of his face. Candles flickered in the wind. Fans hugged each other, strangers bound together by grief. Some wept, some sang, some stood in stunned silence, staring at the image of the boy who became their god. In Los Angeles, black roses were laid along the Hollywood Walk of Fame. Fans knelt beside his star, scribbling lyrics from Crazy Train and No More Tears in chalk across the pavement. Someone played Mama, I'm Coming Home from a battered Bluetooth speaker. The song echoed through the street like a hymn, in dive bars, in bedrooms, in tattoo parlors, in rehab centers. His music played on a loop, not for nostalgia, for comfort. Because when Ozzy died, it wasn't just the end of an era. It was the end of a presence, a guiding noise the world had learned to lean on. And the tributes came in waves. Metallica's James Hetfield called Ozzy the foundation on which we all built. Post Malone wrote, "The honor was mine." Rest easy, legend. Iron Maiden, Judas Priest, Foo Fighters, musicians who owed everything to the trail Ozzy blazed, all said the same thing: there will never be another. A massive tribute concert began forming, whispered to be hosted at Wembley Stadium, with global live streams, dozens of artists, and Sharon herself overseeing every detail, because no one knew how to honor him quite like she did. But the most powerful tributes weren't televised. They came from fans, the ones who shared photos of their Ozzy tattoos, their decades-old concert ticket stubs, their teenage journals full of lyrics that saved their lives, the ones who said, "He got me through it." And as they pressed play on his songs just a little louder than usual, they weren't mourning a man. They were mourning the space he left behind. In the end, Ozzy Osbourne didn't just leave us with records. He left us with instructions, a philosophy disguised as distortion, a spiritual compass hidden beneath heavy metal. Be wild, be honest, be real, be broken, but never be quiet. His legacy isn't etched in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It's tattooed on arms, scrawled in notebooks, whispered by people who once stood at the edge and stepped back because Ozzy screamed for them when they couldn't. He never asked to be a role model. He never claimed redemption. But what he offered, unintentionally, was more powerful than sermons or slogans. He offered survival. He showed us that pain doesn't disqualify you, that relapse doesn't erase progress, that madness, when embraced, can become music. He lived out loud. He fell apart in public. He let the world see the mess. And that was radical, because he didn't build walls around his pain. He built amplifiers. And when the final moment came, when the curtain fell, when Sharon stood over the man she had resurrected time and time again, the world didn't lose a rock star. It lost a mirror that reflected back every insecure kid, every addict in recovery, every misfit who just needed to know they weren't alone. And that is immortality. Because when the silence gets too loud again, we'll press play, and there he'll be.